At 10 hours and 22 minutes, on the morning of June the 4th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Richard Halsey Best pushed forward on the stick of his Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber. The aircraft's nose dropped sharply, the horizon disappeared. The blue Pacific Ocean filled his windscreen. Below him, 14,000 feet down, the Japanese aircraft carrier, Akagi, was turning into the wind, her flight deck crowded with aircraft, fuel hoses snaking across the deck, Ordnance crews frantically rearming planes that had just returned from bombing Midway atoll. Best's decision in the next 60 seconds would change the course of World War II. But to understand why this moment mattered, and why Best made the choice he did, we need to understand what brought him to this point 14,000 feet above the Pacific, and why the aircraft he was flying, the SBD Dauntless, had been built for exactly this kind of impossible dive. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Richard Halsey. Best was born in Bayonne, New Jersey, on March 24, 1910. His grandfather, Edward Best, had emigrated from England in the 1800s, settling first in Wisconsin, where he mustered into F Company of the 13th Wisconsin Infantry during the American Civil War. The family eventually moved to California, then Oregon. Edward's son, Bert Best, born in California in 1878, became Richard's father. Best enrolled in the United States Naval Academy in 1928. He graduated with honors in 1932, commissioned as an ensign in a navy that was still bound by the Washington Naval Treaty limitations. The treaty, signed in 1922, had attempted to prevent another world war by limiting the number and size of capital ships each naval power could build. Battleships remained the primary measure of naval strength. Aircraft carriers were experimental vessels, limited to a combined tonnage far below that allowed for battleships. After graduation, Best served the mandatory 2 years at sea aboard the light cruiser USS Richmond. Surface warfare was the traditional path to advancement in the Navy. Gunnery officers and ship commanders earned promotions. Aviators were seen as useful for reconnaissance, perhaps for attacking shore installations, but not as the decisive arm of naval power. The battleship was king. The battleship would decide the great battles. Best thought differently. In June of 1934, he began flight training at Naval Air Station, Pensacola, Florida. The training was rigorous. Student pilots learned formation flying, navigation, gunnery, and bombing. But most importantly, they learned the physical and mental discipline required to operate in three-dimensional combat where mistakes meant death. The ocean offered no second chances. Best pinned on his golden wings in December of 1935. His excellent performance at Pensacola earned him assignment to Fighting Squadron 2, the Flying Chiefs, aboard USS Lexington. This was the most prestigious fighter squadron in the fleet. Best flew the Grumman F-3F, a stubby biplane fighter that could reach 230 miles per hour and performed aerobatics that would tear apart civilian aircraft. He learned air combat maneuvering. He learned to push an aircraft to its structural limits. But after 3 years flying fighters, Best requested a transfer. He wanted to fly dive bombers. This decision puzzled many of his contemporaries. Fighter pilots were the glamorous branch of naval aviation. Dive bombers were workhorses, slower, less maneuverable, hauling 1,000-pound bombs into anti-aircraft fire. But Best had studied naval warfare. He understood that in any future Pacific conflict, American forces would need to strike Japanese carriers at long range. Fighters could protect the fleet, but dive bombers could sink ships. On May 31, 1940, Best received orders to join Bombing Squadron 6 aboard USS Enterprise. He reported to Naval Air Station North Island, California, on June 10th, and was made Flight Operations Officer, third in the chain of command. The squadron was equipped with the Northrop BT-1 dive bomber, a monoplane design with retractable landing gear, and a top speed of 222 miles per hour. Enterprise was one of 3 Yorktown-class carriers commissioned between 1937 and 1939. She displaced 19,800 tons, carried 90 aircraft, and could make 32 knots. She was fast enough to operate independently, conducting hit-and-run strikes against enemy positions. She represented the Navy's future, though few admirals in 1940 fully understood this. The squadron converted to the Douglas SBD-2 Dauntless in late 1941. The SBD, Scout Bomber Douglas, was a revolutionary aircraft, though it looked unremarkable. Low-wing monoplane, fixed landing gear with streamlined wheel pants, two-man crew, top speed 250 miles per hour, range 1,100 miles. These specifications suggested a competent but unexceptional dive bomber. The SBD's real innovation was structural. The aircraft was built to withstand the enormous stresses of a near-vertical dive, followed by a high-G pullout. Most aircraft of the era were designed to fly level. Banking turns and shallow dives were acceptable. Prolonged high-G maneuvers would cause structural failure. Wings would separate from the fuselage. Control surfaces would tear off. The SBD's wing was a stressed skin, multi-cell design. Internal ribs and spars distributed loads across the entire structure. The wing could handle over 6 times the force of gravity without failing. The fuselage was reinforced at attachment points. The empennage was oversized to maintain control authority during the dive. Every structural element was calculated to allow the pilot to point the nose straight down, accelerate to terminal velocity, then pull out violently at low altitude. The dive brakes were equally critical. Mounted on the trailing edge of each wing, these were perforated metal surfaces that could be extended into the airstream. When deployed, they created enormous drag, limiting the aircraft's dive speed to approximately 240 knots, indicated airspeed. Without the dive brakes, the SBD would accelerate past 400 knots in a vertical dive. At that speed, the aircraft would be uncontrollable. The pullout would exceed structural limits. The pilot would black out from G-forces before reaching safe altitude. With dive brakes deployed, the pilot could maintain a 70 to 75-degree dive angle while keeping airspeed constant. This meant he could track the target continuously during the entire dive. He could make corrections for wind drift. He could adjust his aim as the target maneuvered. The bombing accuracy was extraordinary. A well-trained pilot could put a 1,000-pound bomb within 100 feet of his aim point from 14,000 feet. This accuracy came at a price. The dive was terrifying. The pilot would approach the target at 14,000 to 16,000 feet, cruising at about 150 knots. When the target passed beneath his feet, he would push the stick forward. The nose would drop past the horizon. The dive angle would steepen to 40 degrees, 50 degrees, 60 degrees, 70 degrees. The aircraft would be pointing almost straight down at the ocean. The engine noise would become deafening. The Wright R-1820, a cyclone radial engine mounted ahead of the cockpit, would scream at full throttle. Propeller wash would blast back over the open canopy. The slipstream would tear at the pilot's flight suit and helmet. Loose items in the cockpit would float momentarily before the dive stabilized. The pilot would look through his bomb sight, a simple telescopic device mounted on the left side of the cockpit. He would put the crosshairs on the target. The target would grow larger in the sight. The target ship would fill his entire field of view. Anti-aircraft fire would begin. Black puffs of exploding shells would appear around the aircraft. Tracers would arc up from the ship. The pilot would hear fragments hitting the wings and fuselage. At 2,500 feet, with the ship filling his windscreen, the pilot would pull the bomb release lever. The 1,000-pound bomb would separate from the belly shackles. The aircraft would immediately feel lighter. The pilot would pull back hard on the stick. 4 Gs, 5 Gs, 6 Gs. The blood would drain from his head toward his feet. His vision would narrow. Grey-out would threaten to become blackout. He would feel an enormous weight pressing him into his seat. The horizon would reappear. The nose would rise past level. The aircraft would bottom out at 900 to 1,200 feet, depending on release altitude and G-loading. Bomb fragments from his own weapon would be exploding upward from 500 feet. If he pulled out too low, his own bomb would kill him. This was what the SBD Dauntless was built to do. This was why Best had requested transfer to dive bombers. This was the skill he had spent 2 years perfecting. He had logged 2,700 flight hours by June of 1942. He had made over 300 carrier landings. He had practiced dive bombing until the maneuver was muscle memory. He could execute a 70-degree dive in any weather, in any sea state, against any target. By early 1942, after the Pacific War had begun, Best had advanced to executive officer of Bombing Squadron 6. His commander was Lieutenant Commander William Hollingsworth, known as Holly, a close friend and Naval Academy classmate. They had trained together, flown together, developed the tactics that would take Bombing Squadron 6 into combat. On December 7, 1941, Enterprise was operating 200 miles south of Pearl Harbor. At approximately 06 hours 15 minutes, the carrier launched 18 SBDs to search ahead of the formation. Lieutenant Commander Howard Young led 12 planes from Scouting Squadron 6 and 5 from Bombing Squadron 6. Best was not among them. He watched from Enterprise's deck as the scouts disappeared over the horizon. 2 hours later, the returning scouts reported that Pearl Harbor was under attack. Several SBDs flying into Pearl Harbor during the Japanese strike were shot down by Japanese fighters. Others were destroyed on the ground at Marine Corps Air Station Iwa. Best watched his squadron mates die that morning. He had an abiding thirst for vengeance that would drive him for the next 6 months. Enterprise immediately put to sea. The carrier could not remain near Oahu, where Japanese submarines might be lurking. For the next 3 months, Enterprise conducted hit-and-run raids against Japanese-held islands. In February of 1942, Best flew in strikes against Kwajalein Atoll and Wake Island. In March, he participated in the raid on Marcus Island. These operations caused minimal damage to Japanese forces, but they served notice that the United States Navy was still fighting. More importantly, these raids provided combat experience. Best learned what it felt like to fly through anti-aircraft fire. He learned how to track a moving target during a high-speed dive. He learned which visual cues indicated he was pulling out too low. He learned to trust his instruments when his inner ear told him the aircraft was doing something it wasn't. He learned to compartmentalize fear, to focus entirely on the target, to ignore the tracers and the explosions and the possibility of death. In May of 1942, Enterprise participated in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Though Best's squadron did not engage, the battle was fought entirely by carrier aircraft. No surface ships fired at each other. American forces sank the light carrier Shoho and damaged the fleet carrier Shokaku. Japanese forces sank USS Lexington and damaged USS Yorktown. It was a tactical draw, but strategically, it prevented the Japanese from capturing Port Moresby. More significantly, the Battle of the Coral Sea demonstrated that carriers would decide. The Pacific War. Battleships were too slow to catch carriers. Battleships could not strike at ranges beyond their gun range. Carriers could launch aircraft that could attack targets 200 miles away. The Navy that controlled carrier aviation would control the Pacific. By late May of 1942, American codebreakers had determined that Japan was planning a major operation against a location designated AF in intercepted communications. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo in Hawaii suspected that AF meant Midway Atoll. To confirm this, Midway was instructed to send a false message in the clear that their freshwater distillation plant had broken down. 2 days later, Japanese communications mentioned that AF was short of fresh water. The target was confirmed. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, had 3 carriers available. Enterprise and USS Hornet were operating together as Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Yorktown, despite heavy damage from the Coral Sea, was rapidly repaired at Pearl Harbor and sorted on May 30th as Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Fletcher, as senior officer, commanded the combined force. The American plan was simple: Position the carriers northeast of Midway. Wait for Japanese forces to attack Midway. Launch airstrikes against the Japanese carriers while they were recovering aircraft from the Midway strike. The plan assumed American scout planes would locate the Japanese carriers early enough to launch coordinated strikes. Lieutenant Commander William Hollingsworth had been promoted and transferred to staff duty. Best was promoted to Lieutenant Commander and given command of Bombing Squadron 6 on May 29, 1942. He was 32 years old. He had been flying for 7 years. He had accumulated more dive bombing experience than almost any pilot in the Navy. Now he would lead 16 SBD Dauntlesses into the largest carrier battle of the war. Best spent the night of June the 3rd sleeping soundly. When asked later about his state of mind, he said, "I slept like a baby." This was not bravado. Best had absolute confidence in his aircraft, his training, and his squadron. He knew the SBD could do what no other aircraft in the world could do. He knew his pilots were prepared. He knew that if they could find the Japanese carriers at the right moment, they could sink them. The Douglas SBD Dauntless looked slow and obsolete. Its fixed landing gear created drag. Its two-man crew seemed inefficient compared to single-seat fighters. Its top speed of 250 miles per hour was far slower than the F-4F Wildcat fighter or the Japanese Zero. Pilots called it slow but deadly, joking about its SBD designation. But the SBD possessed one capability that would prove decisive at Midway. It could perform a 70-degree dive that was accurate, survivable, and repeatable. No other dive bomber in the world matched this combination. The German Ju-77 Stuka could dive steeply, but was slow and vulnerable to fighters. The Japanese Aichi D3A Val was maneuverable, but structurally limited. The SAE SBD was the only dive bomber that could routinely place bombs on target from high altitude while surviving intense anti-aircraft fire. On the morning of June the 4th, 1942, Enterprise began launching aircraft at 07 hours, 6 minutes. The deck was crowded. 34 SBD Dauntlesses had to be launched, along with 14 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers and 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters. Best's Bombing Squadron 6 and Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's Scouting Squadron 6 would attack together. McCluskey, recently promoted from Fighter Squadron Commander to Air Group Commander, was flying his first dive bomber mission. The launch took over an hour. Aircraft launched one at a time, circled the carrier, formed up in squadron groups. By the time the last aircraft was airborne, the first planes had burned through 30 minutes of fuel. McCluskey laid the formation west-southwest toward the expected position of the Japanese carriers. The flight was routine for the first hour. Clear sky, unlimited visibility, calm seas. The SBDs cruised at 14,000 feet in a loose formation. Each aircraft carried a single 1,000-pound bomb under the fuselage and 250-pound bombs under the wings. The bomb load represented the maximum that could be carried to the expected target distance. At 09 hours 20 minutes, McCluskey reached the briefed intercept point. No Japanese ships were visible. The ocean was empty. McCluskey made a decision that would later be recognized as brilliant, though it was based partly on intuition and partly on luck. He turned northwest and continued searching. Meanwhile, the TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown had already found the Japanese carriers. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise, Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown, and Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet attacked between 09 hours, 30 minutes, and 10 hours 00 minutes. The attacks were catastrophic failures. The TBDs were slow, approximately 100 knots during their torpedo runs. Japanese Zero fighters slaughtered them. Of 41 TBD Devastators that attacked, 35 were shot down. Only 6 returned to their carriers. Not a single torpedo hit. But the TBD attacks achieved something crucial. They pulled the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level. Every Japanese Zero was low, chasing torpedo bombers, machine gunning them out of the sky. The sky above the Japanese carriers was empty. At 09 hours 55 minutes, McCluskey's dive bombers spotted a lone Japanese destroyer. The ship was the Arashi, which had been depth-charging the American submarine USS Nautilus. The destroyer was now steaming northeast at high speed, heading back toward the Japanese carrier force. McCluskey followed the destroyer's wake. At 10 hours 20 minutes, McCluskey saw them, 4 Japanese carriers arranged in a rough box formation, Kaga and Akagi to the north, Soryu and Hiryu to the south. The carriers were separated by several miles. Aircraft were visible on the flight decks. The carriers were turning into the wind. They were preparing to launch. Best looked down at the scene from 14,000 feet. He could see everything. Kaga was closest. Perhaps 3 miles ahead, Akagi was beyond Kaga. Slightly to the left, Soryu was to the right. Hiryu was obscured by clouds. The carriers were vulnerable. Their flight decks were crowded with aircraft. Fuel hoses snaked across the deck where planes were being refueled. Ordnance carts sat near aircraft that were being rearmed. The Japanese had been caught in a moment of maximum vulnerability. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force, had spent the morning reacting to contradictory information. His initial strike on Midway had reported that a second attack was necessary. Nagumo ordered his reserve aircraft rearmed with high-explosive bombs for a second Midway strike. Then a scout plane reported American ships to the northeast. Nagumo reversed his order. The reserve aircraft had to be rearmed again with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for an anti-ship strike. This rearming process took time. Ordnance crews had to bring bombs up from the magazines, remove high-explosive bombs from aircraft, lower them to the magazines, bring up torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, mount them on the aircraft. While this was happening, the first strike force was returning from Midway, low on fuel, needing to land immediately. Nagumo had to recover the returning aircraft before he could launch his anti-ship strike. The flight decks were chaos. Returning aircraft were landing. Fuel hoses were connected to refuel them. New aircraft were being spotted on the deck for launch. Ordnance that had been removed from the reserve strike aircraft was sitting in unprotected carts on the hangar deck. Aviation gasoline vapor filled the hangars. The entire carrier force was a catastrophe waiting to happen. Best understood immediately what he was seeing. This was the moment. If the dive bombers struck now, before the Japanese could launch, the carriers would be destroyed. If the dive bombers hesitated, if they circled to coordinate the attack, the Japanese would launch their strike. American carriers would be destroyed instead. McCluskey made his decision. Attack immediately. He led Scouting Squadron 6 into a dive on Kaga. But McCluskey had never flown dive bombers operationally. He didn't fully understand dive bomber doctrine. The doctrine, developed over years of peacetime training, specified that when attacking 2 carriers close together, the first squadron would attack the far carrier, while the trailing squadron attacked the near carrier. This prevented multiple squadrons from concentrating on one target while ignoring the other. Best watched McCluskey dive on Kaga. He expected McCluskey to lead his squadron across the formation to attack Akagi, the more distant carrier. Instead, McCluskey dove straight ahead on Kaga. Scouting Squadron 6 followed him. Then most of Bombing Squadron 6 followed McCluskey as well. 31 SBD Dauntlesses were diving on Kaga. 0 were diving on Akagi. Best realized what was happening. If everyone attacked Kaga, Akagi would escape. Akagi would launch her strike. Akagi would destroy American carriers. Best made a decision that required violating every formation flying principle he had been taught. He broke formation. He took his 2 wingmen, Lieutenant Junior Grade Edwin Kroger and Ensign Frederick Weber, and turned left toward Akagi. 3 aircraft, 3 dive bombers against a Japanese carrier defended by anti-aircraft guns and any Zero fighters that might climb to intercept. Navy doctrine stated that a force of fewer than 18 dive bombers was insufficient to suppress carrier defenses. Best was attacking with 3. If he succeeded, he would have violated doctrine and gotten away with it. If he failed, he would be court-martialed for abandoning his squadron, assuming he survived, to face charges. Best didn't hesitate. He pushed the throttle forward. His wingmen followed. The 3 SBDs separated from the formation and flew across the Japanese task force toward Akagi. Below them, Kaga was already under attack. Best could see dive bombers falling out of the sky like rain. He could see bombs hitting the carrier. Explosions blossomed on Kaga's flight deck. Akagi's crew saw Kaga burning. They were watching their sister ship die. Then Best pushed his stick forward and rolled into his dive. Kroger followed. Weber followed. 3 dive bombers in trail formation, one behind the other, descending at 70 degrees. The dive was textbook. Best deployed his dive brakes immediately. The perforated surfaces extended into the slipstream. Airspeed stabilized at 240 knots. The aircraft shuddered, but remained stable. Best looked through his bomb sight. Akagi's flight deck filled the sight picture. He could see the red circle of the rising sun painted on the deck. He put his crosshairs on that circle. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from Akagi and the surrounding ships. Black puffs of exploding shells appeared around Best's aircraft. Tracers arced upward, leaving glowing trails against the blue sky. Best ignored them. His entire focus narrowed to the bomb site and the deck below. Akagi turned hard to port, trying to evade. The ship heeled over, white water foaming along her starboard side. Best adjusted his dive angle slightly, keeping the crosshairs centered on the flight deck. The ship grew larger. He could see individual aircraft spotted on the deck. He could see crew members running. He could see fuel hoses and ordnance carts. At 2,500 feet, Best pulled the bomb release lever. The 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb separated cleanly from the belly. Shackles. The aircraft jumped upward, suddenly lighter by half a ton. Best immediately pulled back, hard, on the stick. 6 times the force of gravity pressed him into his seat. His vision narrowed. The edges of his sight grayed. He grunted, forcing blood back into his brain. The horizon appeared. The nose rose past level. Best leveled off at 1,000 feet and immediately banked right, heading away from the Japanese formation. He glanced back over his shoulder, kicking the rudder to swing the tail out of the way so he could see. Akagi's flight deck was erupting. Best's bomb had struck just aft of the midship elevator, almost exactly amidships. The armor-piercing bomb punched through the wooden flight deck and exploded in the upper hangar deck below. The hangar was packed with 18 Nakajima B-5N2 Kate bombers, fully fueled, armed with torpedoes. Aviation gasoline vapor filled the space. The explosion ignited everything. Fuel tanks ruptured, torpedoes cooked off. Secondary explosions rippled through the hangar. Fire spread to the lower hangar deck where more aircraft were stored. Within seconds, both hangar decks were infernos. Smoke poured from the elevator openings. Flames shot upward, engulfing the island's superstructure. Best didn't see all of this. He saw the initial explosion, saw smoke begin to pour from the carrier. Then he was past, heading east toward Enterprise, 200 miles away. His rear seat gunner, aviation radio man, second-class James Murray, watched Akagi burning as they withdrew. Murray later said he saw the flash of Best's bomb through the smoke as it struck. Behind them, the Battle of Midway was being decided in minutes. Kaga had been hit by 4 bombs from Scouting Squadron 6. She was burning out of control. Soryu had been attacked by dive bombers from Yorktown and was ablaze. 3 Japanese carriers were dying. Only Hiryu, hidden by clouds during the initial attack, remained operational. Best's attack on Akagi was complete by 10 hours, 26 minutes. The entire dive from pushover to pullout had taken less than 2 minutes. In those 2 minutes, Best had made the most important dive of his life. Akagi was the flagship of the Kido Butai, the Japanese carrier striking force. She was the flagship that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Now, she was burning. The flight back to Enterprise took over an hour. Best's fuel gauge showed he had enough to make it, but with little margin for error. He navigated by dead reckoning, using time, distance, and heading to estimate his position. At 11 hours 45 minutes, he spotted Enterprise's distinctive silhouette. He entered the landing pattern, deployed his landing gear and flaps, and trapped aboard at 12 hours 03 minutes. As Best climbed out of his cockpit, he began coughing. Blood came up. During the dive, his oxygen rebreather system had malfunctioned. Caustic soda, used in the rebreather to absorb carbon dioxide, had been blown into his breathing system. Best had inhaled the caustic fumes throughout the dive. The chemical had activated latent tuberculosis in his lungs. Best didn't know this yet. He debriefed with the intelligence officers, describing his attack. Then he learned that Hiryu, the 4th Japanese carrier, was still operational. Hiryu had launched strikes that had crippled Yorktown. Enterprise was launching a second strike to destroy Hiryu. Best immediately volunteered to lead Bombing Squadron 6 on the second mission. At 15 hours 30 minutes, Best took off again. 24 SBD Dauntlesses headed northwest. They found Hiryu at 17 hours 0 minutes. The carrier was steaming alone. Her escort scattered. Best led his squadron into a 70-degree dive. His bomb possibly hit Hiryu amidships, forward of the island. Other bombs from the squadron definitely struck. Hiryu was set ablaze. When Best landed back aboard Enterprise at 18 hours 30 minutes, he was coughing blood continuously. The ship's doctor examined him and diagnosed severe respiratory damage. Best had flown his last combat mission. June 4th, 1942, was the last day he would fly operationally. In one day, Best had participated in attacks that sank 2 Japanese carriers. He was the only pilot at Midway to score hits on 2 separate carriers in a single day. His attack on Akagi with only 3 aircraft had been audacious to the point of recklessness, but it had worked. Akagi burned through the night and was scuttled by Japanese destroyers on the morning of June the 5th. Best spent the next year in hospitals battling tuberculosis. He was medically retired from the Navy in 1944 with the rank of Lieutenant Commander. For his actions at Midway, he was awarded the Navy Cross and the Distinguished Flying Cross. The Navy Cross citation read, "Defying extreme danger from concentrated anti-aircraft barrage and powerful fighter opposition, Lieutenant Commander Best, with bold determination and courageous zeal, led his squadron in dive-bombing assaults against Japanese naval units. Flying at a distance from his own forces, which rendered return unlikely because of probable fuel exhaustion, he pressed home his attacks with extreme disregard for his own personal safety." After the war, Best worked as a security analyst for the Rand Corporation in Santa Monica, California. He spent 30 years there, retiring in 1975. He lived quietly, rarely discussing his Midway experience. When asked why he climbed on that burning tank destroyer, wait, that was a different hero. When asked why he broke formation to attack Akagi with only 3 aircraft, Best's answer was characteristically modest. He simply said it needed to be done. The Douglas SBD Dauntless sank more enemy shipping in the Pacific than any other Allied bomber. At Midway alone, SBD dive bombers sank 4 Japanese carriers in a single day. The aircraft that pilots jokingly called slow but deadly had proven that precision mattered more than speed. The 70-degree dive that seemed suicidally steep had proven to be the most accurate bombing technique of the war. Richard Halsey Best died on October 28, 2001 at the age of 91. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. His gravestone is simple, listing his name, rank, and dates. It does not mention that he changed the course of World War II in a 2-minute dive from 14,000 feet. The Battle of Midway was decided by many factors: American code breakers who identified the target, Admiral Nimitz who positioned his carriers perfectly, the torpedo bomber crews who sacrificed themselves to pull Japanese fighters out of position. But ultimately, the battle was decided by dive bomber pilots like Dick Best, who pushed their sticks forward, pointed their noses at the ocean, and trusted their aircraft and their training to put bombs exactly where they needed to be. The SBD Dauntless looked obsolete in 1942. It would be officially replaced by the faster, more powerful Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver in 1944. But pilots who flew both aircraft consistently preferred the SBD. It was stable, reliable, and forgiving. It could absorb incredible battle damage and bring its crew home. Most importantly, it could perform the one maneuver that mattered most in the Pacific War, a controlled 70-degree dive that turned altitude into accuracy and accuracy into victory. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.